What would you do if two police officers arrested you for driving while black, but you had a direct line to the White House? Have you ever been judged by your appearance before anyone knew your story? Has someone in your community been treated unfairly because of assumptions made in the first 5 seconds of meeting them? Keep that feeling in mind, because today's story isn't just about injustice. It's about the explosive moment when power, prejudice, and consequences collide in ways that shock an entire nation. If you think you know how this ends, think again. What unfolded next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, respect, and the price of underestimating someone based on what you see on the surface. It was a bright Saturday afternoon in Montgomery, Alabama, the kind of day where families gather, children laugh, and grandfathers sit proudly watching their granddaughters sing in church choirs. Colonel Antoine Rivers, though nobody called him Colonel anymore, was driving his old Ford pickup truck home from just such a moment. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and an easy smile that came from decades of hard-earned wisdom, he looked like any other grandfather heading home after a perfect family afternoon. But Antoine Rivers was not just any grandfather. While neighbors saw a friendly black man who kept his lawn neat and always waved hello, Washington, D.C. saw something entirely different. They saw a decorated U.S. Army veteran who had served 32 years, rising from a young private in the Gulf War to a senior officer whose phone calls were returned by people most Americans would never meet. His chest bore ribbons from Iraq, Afghanistan, and humanitarian missions that had saved lives across 3 continents. Among those medals was a Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for an act of extraordinary bravery that saved 14 soldiers during an ambush in Kandahar. A moment of split-second courage under fire that most people would never hear about, because Antoine Rivers was not the type of man who talked about his wars at neighborhood barbecues. 2 years into retirement, he spent his time mentoring struggling veterans and advising the Department of Defense on policy reforms. To the Pentagon, he was an invaluable asset. To his granddaughter, Amara, he was just grandpa who never missed her choir recitals and made the best pancakes on Sunday mornings. But that Saturday afternoon, 2 police officers saw none of this. They didn't see the medals, the service record, or the direct access to the highest levels of government. They saw his skin color. They saw assumptions. They saw an opportunity to flex their authority on someone they thought had no power to fight back. They were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong they were. Stay with me, because what happened in the next 30 minutes didn't just destroy 2 careers. It sent shockwaves through police departments across the country and sparked conversations about respect, service, and recognition that are still happening today. If you're ready to witness how one phone call can bring justice crashing down like a house of cards, hit that like button right now. And let's jump into a story that proves why you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book has a direct line to the most powerful office in America. To truly understand what happened that day in Montgomery, you need to know who Antoine Rivers really was. Not just a man the world saw, but the soldier, the leader, and the hero whose story was written in battles most people never heard about. Antoine's military journey began in 1989, when he was just 19 years old, a young man from Alabama who enlisted during the final days of the Cold War. He started as a private, carrying nothing but determination and a belief that serving his country was the highest calling he could answer. What nobody predicted, including Antoine himself, was that he would spend the next 3 decades becoming one of the most respected logistical minds in the U.S. Army. His first real test came during the Gulf War in 1991. While other soldiers his age were still figuring out military life, Antoine was already showing the calm leadership that would define his career. He didn't just follow orders. He anticipated problems, found solutions, and kept his unit supplied and operational when supply lines broke down in the desert heat of Kuwait. But it was Afghanistan where Antoine Rivers became a legend. The year was 2003, and Captain Rivers, now 14 years into his military career, was leading a convoy through the mountains outside Kandahar. Intelligence had reported the route clear, but intelligence was wrong. The lead Humvee hit an improvised explosive device, and within seconds, insurgents opened fire from elevated positions on both sides of the narrow mountain pass. Most commanders would have called for immediate evacuation. Antoine did something different. While bullets shattered the windshields around him, He organized a counterattack that not only extracted his wounded soldiers, but turned a deadly ambush into a tactical victory. For 6 hours, under relentless fire, he coordinated air support, managed casualty evacuation, and held the position until reinforcements arrived. 14 men went home to their families that night because Antoine Rivers refused to leave anyone behind. The Distinguished Service Cross he received for that day wasn't just a medal. It was recognition of the kind of courage that separates heroes from everyone else. The citation read simply, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." But the men who were there knew the real story. They knew Antoine had looked death in the face and chosen to save others instead of himself. Over the next 19 years, Antoine continued rising through the ranks. He became the go-to officer for impossible logistics missions. When Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, Antoine coordinated the military's humanitarian response. When earthquakes shattered Haiti in 2010, he managed supply chains that brought food and medical aid to hundreds of thousands of people. His phone number was in the contacts of generals, senators, and cabinet members who knew that when Antoine Rivers said something could be done, it would be done. By the time he retired as a full colonel in 2021, Antoine had overseen operations that touched 3 continents. He had trained thousands of soldiers, saved countless lives, and earned the kind of respect that opens doors most people don't even know exist. The Department of Defense didn't just thank him for his service. They kept him on as an advisor because his expertise was too valuable to lose. But here's what made Antoine Rivers truly special. Despite all his achievements, all his medals, and all his connections, he never forgot where he came from. He spent his retirement mentoring young veterans struggling with civilian life. He advised military families dealing with deployment stress. He showed up at VA hospitals not for photo opportunities, but because he genuinely cared about soldiers who were still fighting battles long after they came home. His neighbors in Montgomery knew him as the quiet man who mowed his lawn every Saturday, who always had time to help fix a broken fence, and who never missed his granddaughter's school events. They had no idea that the same hands that waved hello over the garden fence had once coordinated operations that changed the course of military engagements halfway around the world. To his granddaughter Amara, he wasn't Colonel Rivers or a decorated war hero. He was just Grandpa, the man who taught her to throw a baseball, who made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse, and who always had the perfect story to tell when she couldn't fall asleep. This was the man driving home from a choir recital that Saturday afternoon. A man whose value couldn't be measured by the truck he drove or the clothes he wore, but by the lives he had saved and the respect he had earned through 3 decades of selfless service. It was 2:47 p.m. when the blue and red lights first appeared in Antoine's rear-view mirror. Officers Bradley Cox and Trevor Mullins had been patrolling Jefferson Avenue when they spotted the old Ford pickup ahead of them. 2 white men in their 30s, both with less than 8 years on the force between them. They were the kind of cops who saw every traffic stop as an opportunity to serve authority rather than serve the community. Cox, the senior partner, had a reputation around the precinct for what he called proactive policing, a fancy term for stopping people based on hunches that somehow always seemed to target Black and Hispanic drivers. Mullins, eager to impress and quick, to follow his partner's lead, was the type who asked questions first and thought about consequences later. They had been looking for a reason to pull over the pickup truck for 3 blocks, and when Antoine's turn signal flickered just a fraction of a second after he started his turn, a violation so minor most officers would have ignored completely, they had their excuse. Antoine pulled over immediately, no sudden movements, no hesitation. 32 years of military discipline had taught him that cooperation and respect were always the best first approach, even when dealing with people who might not deserve it. He turned off the engine, placed his hands clearly visible on the steering wheel, and waited. Cox approached the driver's side window with the swagger of a man who believed his badge gave him the right to intimidate anyone he chose. Mullins positioned himself near the passenger side, hand resting casually on his weapon, a completely unnecessary show of force for a simple traffic violation. License and registration. Cox barked before Antoine even had a chance to speak. "Good afternoon, officer," Antoine responded calmly, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man accustomed to keeping his composure under pressure. He reached slowly for his wallet, making sure every movement was deliberate and visible. Here's my license. Registration is in the glove compartment if you need it. The politeness in Antoine's voice seemed to irritate Cox rather than calm him. Some people interpret courtesy as weakness, and Cox was exactly that type of person. Where are you coming from? Cox demanded, snatching the license without a word of acknowledgement. From my granddaughter's choir recital at First Baptist. Antoine replied evenly, headed back home now. Cox studied the license with exaggerated suspicion, as if a veteran with a spotless driving record might somehow be carrying false identification. Meanwhile, Mullins had moved closer to the truck, peering through the windows with a kind of invasive scrutiny that had nothing to do with traffic safety. "This your truck?" Mullins called out, his tone already accusatory. "Doesn't look like something you could afford." The words hit Antoine like a slap. He had heard variations of that insult his entire life. The assumption that a black man driving anything nicer than a beat-up car must have stolen it, borrowed it, or obtained it through some illegal means. It was the kind of casual racism that cut deep because it was delivered so matter-of-factly, as if questioning his right to own property was perfectly reasonable. Antoine's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, sir, it's my truck. My name's on the title. Registration's in the glove box if you'd like to verify that." Instead of following standard procedure, checking the registration, writing a simple warning, and sending everyone on their way, both officers seemed to take Antoine's calm responses as some kind of challenge to their authority. "Step out of the vehicle," Cox ordered suddenly. Antoine blinked. "May I ask why, officer? I provided my license. I've answered your questions, and I haven't violated any." "I said step out of the vehicle. Now!" Can you believe staying calm in a situation like this? Drop a comment below. Have you or someone you know faced something similar? Because what happened next shows just how quickly a routine traffic stop can turn into something much more serious. Antoine stepped out of his truck slowly, hands visible, movements deliberate. 3 decades of military training had taught him that de-escalation was always preferable to confrontation. But he was beginning to realize that these officers had no interest in de-escalation. "Hands on the hood," Cox commanded, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had already decided this interaction would end badly. Antoine complied without protest, placing his palms flat against the warm metal of his truck. The afternoon sun beat down on his back as Mullins began what could only be described as an aggressive pat-down, far more invasive than anything justified by a simple traffic violation. "What are we looking for, officers?" Antoine asked calmly. "I've cooperated fully, provided my identification, and answered all your questions." "Well, ask the questions here," Mullins snapped, continuing his unnecessarily rough search. "You got any weapons? Drugs? Anything illegal in this truck?" "No, sir, nothing like that." But facts didn't seem to matter. Cox had already made up his mind about how this stop would end, and he was looking for any excuse to justify what he planned to do next. When he found none, no weapons, no drugs, no contraband of any kind, he simply manufactured a reason. "You're being detained for resisting and obstructing," Cox announced, pulling out his handcuffs. Antoine's head turned slightly. "Resisting what?" "I complied with every request you've made." "Don't get smart with us," Mullins warned, moving to help restrain a man who hadn't resisted anything. The handcuffs clicked around Antoine's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo down the street. By now, several pedestrians had stopped to watch the scene unfold. They saw a well-dressed black man in his late 50s, salt and pepper hair, catching the Alabama sunlight, being treated like a dangerous criminal for reasons nobody could understand. What they didn't see were the invisible ribbons across his chest, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Combat Action Badge. They didn't know about the nights he had spent pulling wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, or the humanitarian missions where he had coordinated aid for disaster victims. They couldn't see the Distinguished Service Cross that represented the highest level of valor and sacrifice. All they saw was another black man being humiliated by police officers who seemed to enjoy their work a little too much. As Cox and Mullins walked Antoine toward their patrol car, the insults began in earnest. "Bet you got a record somewhere," Mullins said with a smirk. "Guys like you always have something hiding in your past." Antoine said nothing. He had learned long ago that some battles were worth fighting, and others were worth surviving. But as he settled into the back of the patrol car, his mind began to work in ways that would have been familiar to anyone who had ever served under his command. He was thinking strategically now. In Kandahar, when insurgents had his convoy pinned down in a narrow mountain pass, Antoine hadn't panicked. He had assessed the situation, identified his resources, and formulated a plan that turned a potential disaster into a tactical victory. The principles were the same now, even if the battlefield was different. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Antoine thought about the phone number he had memorized years ago, a direct line that few people outside of Washington, D.C. even knew existed. He thought about his security clearance, still active due to his advisory role with the Department of Defense. He thought about the people who took his calls, who trusted his judgment, and who had the power to make problems disappear with a single conversation. But most of all, he thought about the moment in that mountain pass when he looked death in the face and decided that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Cox and Mullins had just arrested a man who had stared down armed insurgents without flinching. They had humiliated a decorated war hero who had earned the respect of generals and cabinet members. They had handcuffed someone with direct access to the highest levels of government. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. Back at the Montgomery Police Department, Antoine sat quietly in the holding area while Cox and Mullins processed what they believed was just another routine arrest. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mullins typed Antoine's information into the computer system, expecting to find the usual collection of minor infractions that would justify their actions. Instead, the screen began displaying information that made both officers stop dead in their tracks. The first red flag appeared in bold letters across the top of the screen. Military DoD clearance level. Secretary access. Mullins blinked and leaned closer. What the hell does that mean? Cox moved behind him to read over his shoulder. Below the clearance notification, more information populated the screen. Occupation: former U.S. Army Colonel, Department of Defense Advisor, active security clearance. But it was the next line that made Cox's blood run cold. Commendations: Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Star Medal, Purple Heart Combat Action Badge. The list continued for several more lines, detailing 3 decades of military service that neither officer had even known existed 30 minutes earlier. Mullins scrolled down further, his hands now noticeably shaking. Under current status, the screen displayed: Retired Colonel, active DoD advisory role, Veteran Affairs Committee member. "This guy isn't just some random person," Cox whispered, his voice barely audible. He's connected to the Pentagon. For 30 minutes, they had mocked, insulted, and humiliated a man whose phone calls were returned by people they would never meet. They had arrested someone whose advice influenced military policy at the highest levels of government. They had handcuffed a decorated war hero whose security clearance gave him access to information they couldn't even comprehend. As the full weight of their mistake began to sink in, Antoine spoke for the first time since arriving at the station. His voice was calm, measured, and carried a quiet authority that neither officer had noticed before. "Gentlemen," he said, not looking up from where he sat with his hands still cupped behind his back, "I've been patient. I've been respectful. I've tolerated your insults, your accusations, and your illegal detention. But my patience has reached its limit." Cox and Mullins exchanged panicked glances. The confident swagger they had displayed during the arrest was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Antoine continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, but somehow filling the entire room with his presence. "You refused to tell me what charges I was facing. You mocked my military service before you even knew I had served. You questioned my right to own property based solely on the color of my skin. You arrested me without cause and humiliated me in front of my community." He finally looked up, meeting their eyes with the steady gaze of a man who had commanded respect on 3 continents. "I've served this country for 32 years. I've been shot at, bombed, and targeted by enemies who wanted to kill me simply because I wore the uniform of the United States Army. I survived all of that, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let 2 local police officers destroy my dignity in the town where I was born." The room fell completely silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of radio chatter from the front desk. "I'm going to make my phone call now," Antoine announced. And I suggest you both start thinking about how you're going to explain this situation to your superiors. The desk sergeant, who had been listening to the conversation with growing concern, approached with the phone. As he unlocked Antoine's handcuffs, his hands were trembling slightly. Antoine rubbed his wrist where the metal had left red marks, then picked up the phone and dialed a number that made the desk sergeant's eyes widen. White House switchboard. How may I direct your call? Came a professional voice on the other end. Cox felt his knees go weak. Mullins grabbed the edge of the desk to steady himself. This is Colonel Antoine Rivers, Antoine said in the same calm, measured tone he had used throughout the entire ordeal. I need to speak with the Chief of Staff immediately. Authorization code Delta, Kilo 91. There was a brief pause, then the sound of the call being transferred. Within seconds, a familiar voice came on the line, surprised, concerned, and clearly alarmed. Tony? What's going on? Why are you calling from Alabama? Hello, Lorraine, Antoine replied, addressing Deputy Chief of Staff Lorraine Maddox, his former colleague from the Pentagon. I've just been unlawfully arrested by 2 police officers here in Montgomery. They detained me without cause, subjected me to racial harassment, and are currently holding me on false charges. This is where everything flips. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't believe what happens next. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone present realized they were witnessing a phone call that would change everything. I understand completely. Lorraine's voice came to the phone speaker, sharp with professional concern. This is absolutely unacceptable. Give me 20 minutes, Tony. Just sit tight. This ends right now. The line went dead, and Antoine calmly handed the phone back to the desk sergeant, whose face had gone completely pale. The silence that followed was a kind of absolute quiet that happens just before a storm hits with devastating force. Cox and Mullins stood frozen, their eyes darting between each other and Antoine, finally understanding that they had just witnessed their careers being destroyed in real time. The man they had mocked and humiliated had just spoken directly to someone in the White House, as if they were old friends, because they were. What happens now? Mullins whispered to his partner, his voice cracking slightly. Antoine answered before Cox could respond. Now, officers, you learn what accountability looks like. For the next 20 minutes, the precinct experienced something none of them had ever seen before. The phone began ringing. Not the usual calls about domestic disputes or traffic accidents, but calls from numbers that appeared on caller ID with area codes that made seasoned police personnel stop what they were doing and pay attention. The first call came from the office of Alabama Governor Robert Channing. His chief of staff, speaking in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to handling crises, demanded to speak with the police chief immediately about a situation involving Colonel Antoine Rivers that requires urgent resolution. The second call came from the office of Senator Patricia Williams, the senior senator from Alabama, whose staff had been briefed within minutes of Lorraine's call to the governor's mansion. Her aide was polite but firm. The senator expected a full report on the incident within the hour. The third call came from the Pentagon itself. A military liaison officer, speaking with the authority of someone who coordinates between civilian law enforcement and federal agencies, requested immediate confirmation of Antoine's status and the circumstances of his detention. Police Chief Michael Harrison arrived at the station 15 minutes after the call started, his usual calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. He had been pulled out of Saturday afternoon barbecue with his family by phone calls from people whose names he recognized from news broadcasts. Where's Colonel Rivers? He demanded as he walked to the front door. The desk sergeant pointed toward the holding area, where Antoine sat with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Chief Harrison approached him with the kind of respect he should have received from the beginning. Colonel Rivers, I am deeply sorry for the situation. I need you to know that this does not represent the values or the training of the Montgomery Police Department. Antoine looked up at the chief with eyes that had seen enough leadership to recognize genuine concern from political damage control. Chief Harrison, I appreciate your words, but apologies need to be backed up by actions. These officers violated my civil rights, subjected me to racial harassment, and arrested me without cause. Harrison nodded grimly. I understand completely, and I assure you this matter will be investigated thoroughly. He turned toward Cox and Mullins, who were standing nearby looking like they wanted to disappear into floor. Officers Cox and Mullins, you're both suspended pending a full internal investigation. The words hit them like physical blows. Cox opened his mouth to protest, but Harrison cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. Not another word. You'll surrender your badges and weapons immediately, and you'll report to Internal Affairs first thing Monday morning. As Antoine's handcuffs were finally removed, nearly an hour after they should have been, more calls continued to come in. The mayor's office, the state attorney general, even a representative from the Department of Justice, who had been contacted through channels that moved faster than either Cox or Mullins could have imagined possible. By the time Antoine walked out of the Montgomery Police Department as a free man, both officers had been suspended, an investigation had been officially opened, and every level of government from local to federal was aware of what had happened on Jefferson Avenue that afternoon. But Antoine knew this was just the beginning. The phone call had been the first move in what would become a much larger battle, not just for his own dignity, but for every veteran, every grandfather, and every American who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. As he stepped into the late afternoon sunlight, Antoine Rivers looked like any other man walking to his pickup truck. But everyone watching now knew exactly who he was. Within 48 hours, what started as a traffic stop on Jefferson Avenue had exploded into a national conversation about respect, service, and the assumptions we make about people based on nothing more than their appearance. The story broke first on local Alabama news, but didn't stay local for long. Decorated Black Army Colonel unlawfully arrested by police became a headline that spread across social media platforms faster than anyone could have predicted. Veterans organizations picked up the story immediately, sharing it with a fury that surprised even seasoned journalists who covered military affairs. The American Legion released a statement within 24 hours. The treatment of Colonel Antoine Rivers represents an unconscionable disrespect for military service and a clear violation of the principles our members have sworn to defend. The veterans of foreign wars follow with their own condemnation. When we allow decorated war heroes to be humiliated based on racial prejudice, we dishonor every person who has ever worn a uniform of the United States. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source, Antoine's fellow Distinguished Service Cross recipients. Only a few hundred people in American history have earned this honor, and when word spread through their tight-knit community, the response was immediate and devastating for the officers involved. Retired General Patricia Coleman, a 3-star general who had served with Antoine in Afghanistan, went on national television to address the incident directly. Antoine Rivers is the kind of soldier who defines honor, courage, and commitment. The fact that he was treated this way in his own hometown is a disgrace that demands accountability at every level. By Tuesday morning, protesters had gathered outside the Montgomery Police Department, not the angry, chaotic demonstrations that sometimes follow police incidents, but organized, respectful gatherings led by veterans wearing their service uniforms. They carried signs reading, "Respect our heroes" and "Service before self," military values that transcended politics and demanded acknowledgement. Governor Robert Channing, recognizing that this was no ordinary police misconduct case, held a press conference that same afternoon. Standing at the podium with the Alabama state flag behind him, he addressed the situation with the gravity it deserved. What happened to Colonel Rivers represents a failure of the most basic standards of human decency, the governor announced. This is not just about police procedure. This is about respecting the people who have sacrificed everything to defend our freedom. He continued with words that will be quoted in newspapers across the country. When we fail to recognize the worth and dignity of our veterans, we fail as a society. Alabama will do better, and we will ensure that this never happens again. Within a week, the internal investigation was complete, and the results were damning. Body camera footage confirmed every detail of Antoine's account. The officers had violated departmental policy, federal civil rights laws, and basic standards of professional conduct. Both Cox and Mullins were terminated immediately, with recommendations that they face federal charges for civil rights violations. But Antoine's response to their firing surprised everyone, including his supporters. At a press conference held at the Montgomery Veterans Affairs office, surrounded by fellow veterans and community leaders, Antoine stepped to the microphone with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "I want to be clear about something," he began, his voice carrying the authority that comes from 3 decades of leadership. "This incident isn't about Antoine Rivers. Yes, I'm a veteran. Yes, I'm a colonel. Yes, I have connections that most people don't have. But that's exactly the problem. The room fell silent as he continued. What if I weren't a decorated veteran? What if I didn't have a direct line to the White House? What if I were just another black grandfather driving home from his granddaughter's recital? Would anyone believe my story? Would the nation care? Would there be protests and press conferences and calls for justice? He let the questions hang in the air, allowing their weight to settle over everyone present. This is bigger than what happened to me on Jefferson Avenue. This is about every American who serves this country with honor, only to come home and be treated as less than human because of assumptions made in the first 5 seconds of an encounter. Antoine's words resonated far beyond that press conference room. They were quoted in op-ed pieces shared by military families and discussed in police academies across the country. Antoine's response shows true leadership. If this story is impacting you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The incident had become something larger than anyone anticipated, a turning point that forced uncomfortable conversations about respect, service, and the price of judging people by their appearance rather than their character. Antoine's questions at that press conference didn't just hang in the air. They sparked a movement that would reshape police training and veteran relations across Alabama and beyond. Within a month of the incident, the Alabama state legislature had fast-tracked the Veteran Recognition and Protection Act, comprehensive legislation requiring all law enforcement agencies to implement specific training programs focused on veteran identification and cultural competency. The new law mandated that police officers receive training on military culture, veteran mental health issues, and the importance of recognizing service members' contributions to their communities. More importantly, it established clear protocols for interacting with veterans and severe penalties for officers who violated these standards. But the changes went deeper than just new laws on paper. Police academies across the state began incorporating case studies of the Rivers incident into their curricula, using it as a teaching moment about implicit bias, professional conduct, and the consequences of allowing personal prejudices to override good judgment. Captain Maria Gonzalez, who oversaw training at the Alabama Police Academy, explained the impact. The Rivers case became our textbook example of what happens when officers let assumptions drive their actions instead of facts. Every recruit now learns about this incident and understands that respecting the people you serve isn't just good policy. It's essential to maintaining public trust. The Montgomery Police Department itself underwent a complete overhaul of its policies and leadership structure. Chief Harrison, recognizing that systemic problems required systemic solutions, partnered with veterans organizations to create an advisory council that will review police procedures and recommend improvements. Antoine was asked to chair this council, and despite his initial reluctance to take on another advisory role, he accepted the position with characteristic dedication to service. If my experience can prevent one other veteran, or anyone else, from being treated the way I was treated, then it was worth it, he explained when announcing his acceptance. Under his leadership, the council implemented revolutionary changes. They established a veteran liaison program that connected former military personnel with local police departments, creating bridges of understanding between two groups that had sometimes viewed each other with suspicion. They created rapid response protocols for incidents involving veterans, ensuring that officers would have immediate access to resources and support systems when dealing with former service members who might be struggling with post-traumatic stress or other service-related challenges. Most importantly, they institutionalized respect as a core value, not just a suggestion in the department handbook. The changes weren't limited to Alabama. Antoine began receiving invitations to speak at police departments, military installations, and government forums across the country. His story became a case study taught at the FBI Academy, the Department of Homeland Security, and military leadership schools. The Pentagon itself took notice, incorporating Antoine's recommendations into federal policies governing interaction between civilian law enforcement and military personnel. His influence extended far beyond the borders of Montgomery, Alabama, touching police departments from California to New York. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the one that couldn't be measured in legislation or policy papers. Antoine's story had fundamentally shifted how people thought about assumptions, respect, and the invisible stories that every person carries. Veterans who had experienced similar incidents, though without Antoine's connections or resources, began coming forward with their own stories. Support networks formed. Legal aid organizations dedicated resources to helping military families navigate civilian systems that sometimes fail to recognize their service. The incident that began with two officers making assumptions about a black man in an old pickup truck had evolved into a nationwide conversation about dignity, service, and the responsibility we all have to see beyond surface appearances. 3 years later, when asked about the long-term impact of that Saturday afternoon, Antoine reflected with typical humility. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen because of one person or one incident. But sometimes a single moment can serve as a catalyst for conversations that needed to happen anyway. The transformation was real, measurable, and ongoing proof that even the most painful experiences can become the foundation for positive change when handled with wisdom and determination. 5 years after that life-changing Saturday afternoon, 12-year-old Amara Rivers sat at her kitchen table working on the most important school assignment of her 7th grade year, an essay titled My Hero. While her classmates wrote about famous athletes, movie stars, or historical figures they had learned about in textbooks, Amara chose to write about the quiet man who made her pancakes every Sunday morning and never missed her school concerts. Her opening paragraph surprised even her teacher. Most people think heroes wear capes or score winning touchdowns or sing on stage. But my hero wears reading glasses and drives an old pickup truck. And the most heroic thing about him isn't what he did in some faraway war. It's how he acted when 2 police officers tried to make him feel small right here at home. Amara had been only 7 years old when the incident happened, but she remembered the conversations that followed. She remembered adults speaking in hushed, serious tones about her grandfather. She remembered news reporters calling their house and community members stopping by to offer support. Most importantly, she remembered how her grandfather handled it all with the same calm dignity he brought to everything else in his life. My grandfather could have been angry, she wrote in her essay. He could have yelled and demanded apologies and tried to get revenge on the people who hurt him. Instead, he asked better questions. He asked, what about the people who don't have powerful friends? What about the grandparents who can't call the White House? What about all the people who get treated badly and nobody ever hears their story? Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, later said that Amara's essay was the most mature and thoughtful piece of writing she had received from a 7th grader in 20 years of teaching. But Amara's perspective on her grandfather's heroism went beyond the obvious lessons about standing up to injustice. She wrote about the smaller moments that revealed his character, how he continued mentoring young veterans even after his own traumatic experience with law enforcement, how he always treated everyone with respect regardless of how they treated him, and how he used his painful experience to help others rather than retreating into bitterness. The real lesson isn't that my grandfather had important friends, Amara concluded in her essay. The real lesson is that he treated everyone like they were important, even when they didn't treat him the same way. He showed me that being a hero isn't about having power. It's about how you use whatever power you have to make things better for other people. Her final paragraph captured something that many adults had struggled to articulate. A man's honor is not given by a badge or uniform. It is carried in the way he lives, even when others refuse to see it. My grandfather taught me that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with dignity, respect, and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions that help everyone grow. When Mrs. Patterson read Amara's essay aloud to the class as an example of exceptional writing, she had to pause several times to compose herself. The wisdom of a 12-year-old girl, filtered through her understanding of her grandfather's experience, had distilled complex issues of justice, respect, and character into truths that resonated with everyone who heard them. Word of Amara's essay eventually reached Antoine himself, who read it with the same quiet pride he had carried throughout his military career and civilian service. When local reporters asked him about his granddaughter's perspective on the incident, his response was characteristically humble. Amara sees things more clearly than most adults, he said with a smile. She understands that the real victory wasn't getting those officers fired or changing police policies, though those things were important. The real victory was proving that dignity and respect can't be taken away from you. They can only be given away, and I chose not to give mine away. The essay became part of Antoine's legacy in ways he never expected. Teachers across Alabama began using it in their classrooms to discuss character, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. It was reprinted in veterans' newsletters, shared at military ceremonies, and quoted in sermons about integrity and grace under pressure. Most importantly, it became a reminder that heroism isn't always dramatic or visible. Sometimes it is quiet as choosing dignity over anger, service over revenge, and hope over bitterness. Today, Colonel Antoine Rivers continues his quiet life in Montgomery, Alabama. He still drives that old Ford pickup truck. Not because he can't afford something newer, but because it serves its purpose and reminds him that a person's worth has nothing to do with what they drive or wear or own. He still mentors young veterans who are struggling to find their place in civilian life. He still serves on advisory councils that work to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities. He still makes Mickey Mouse pancakes for Amara on Sunday mornings, and he still never misses her school concerts. But something fundamental changed that Saturday afternoon 5 years ago, not just for Antoine, but for everyone who heard his story and took the time to really listen to what it meant. The incident revealed something uncomfortable about our society: how quickly we make assumptions about people based on nothing more than their appearance, their age, their race, or the car they drive. It showed us how easily we can dismiss someone's value without ever bothering to learn their story. But it also revealed something beautiful about human nature: how quickly things can change when we choose to see each other with respect and dignity. How powerful it can be when someone refuses to let injustice break their spirit. How much good can come from asking the right questions instead of seeking the easy revenge. Antoine's story forces us to confront our own assumptions and biases. It challenges us to look beyond surface appearances and remember that every person we meet has a story worth respecting, whether they're a decorated war hero or just someone trying to live their life with dignity. The two officers who arrested him that day learned this lesson the hard way. Their careers ended because they chose to see skin color instead of character, assumptions instead of humanity. Their story serves as a warning about the cost of letting prejudice override judgment. But Antoine's story offers something much more powerful than a cautionary tale. It offers hope. Hope that justice can still prevail when good people choose to stand up and speak out. Hope that one person's courage can create ripple effects that touch thousands of lives. Hope that even the most painful experiences can become catalysts for positive change. Most importantly, it reminds us that respect is not something we earn through our achievements or our connections or our status. Respect is something we owe each other simply because we share this human experience together. As you go about your day, remember Antoine Rivers, not just a colonel with medals and White House connections, but the grandfather who chose dignity over anger, service over revenge, and hope over bitterness. Remember that everyone you meet has a story you don't know, experiences you haven't shared, and worth that goes deeper than what you can see on the surface. What's your biggest takeaway from Colonel Rivers' story? Share in the comment below. I'd love to hear how this story impacts your perspective on respect, justice, or the assumptions we make about others. If this opened your eyes to something new or challenged you to think differently about the people around you, hit that like button and let me know this content is making a difference. For more stories that challenge perspectives, inspire change, and remind us of the dignity that every person deserves, subscribe and ring that notification bell. These are the conversations that matter, and I'm honored to share them with you. Until next time, remember what 12-year-old Amara Rivers taught us. A man's honor is not given by a badge or uniform. It is carried in the way he lives, even when others refuse to see it. Everyone you meet has a story worth respecting. Don't let assumptions blind you to the heroes walking among us every day.